Most series have a dark horse, a game that's there with a dedicated fanbase, while the gaming world in general treats it with scorn. You know the kind of game I'm talking about. Final Fantasy XIII, Mass Effect Andromeda, Sonic 2006. Games that some say ruin a franchise, while others stick to more nuanced criticism. Assassin's Creed is no different, with its own fair share of games that people deride for anything from lack of imagination and cut-and-paste mechanics to game-breaking bugs. Assassin's Creed 3 was perhaps the most obvious example, with some fairly lacklustre scores on release and players commenting on a number of foibles they found disappointing. Some said the world was too flat, others commented on the game's lengthy opening segment. Players found themselves wondering if the series had stagnated after the Ezio trilogy, and whether it could pick itself back up. My first experience with Assassin's Creed 3 was somewhat similar. I pre-ordered it from my local game shop and collected it with anticipation. I had played every single other Assassin's Creed game that had come before, and I was excited to see what this one had in store. I stuck it in my Xbox 360, controller in hand, and waited with bated breath for the game to load in. This was something new, I thought as I studied the box, noticing a distinct lack of one Mr. da Firenze. Main character Connor looked new and cool, and so did the setting. Colonial America? Yes please. From there, however, I found my enthusiasm waning. The first 2.5 hours of the game I played as a completely different character, and I discovered after this initial drag that Connor was nowhere near as engaging as I had hoped. He felt dry, boring, and underdeveloped. The graphics I thought were dull, grey and unremarkable, and the story was lengthy and extremely silly. I finished the game and traded it in to buy something else. But has anything changed? Join me as I take a look back at one of Assassin's Creed's most controversial offerings, and see whether the criticisms levelled against it are justified, or whether people were afraid of change after playing, effectively, the same game 3 times before. This is Playing by Series, and today we're playing through Assassin's Creed 3. One of the main criticisms levelled against Assassin's Creed 3 were complaints about the game's graphics. Gone were the sun-soaked rooftops of Italy and Constantinople, and in their place the grey colonial skyline felt drab and boring. The sun was a rare sight, and the forest you could explore and hunt in relegate you to running around on the ground as you stalk your mostly antlered prey. Certainly then, a departure from the rest of the series, especially when you consider what the game was supposed to be. Players were led to believe that this was to be a massive graphical step up from the previous game. Claims were made about the textures on display and the lighting effects. The developers wanted to take players somewhere new, but also familiar to a large chunk of the player base. Unlike previous games, the setting wasn't particularly well known for being sun-drenched or for its ancient medieval architecture. This was something new and different, and players didn't like it. Today, however, you get the feeling that this game was designed with the next generation of consoles in mind. The draw distances are iffy, and there's an indomitable fog that hangs over the world that feels suspiciously like it was there to hide the lack of processing oomph that the new graphics demanded. At the time, it all felt ambitious, but hampered. The issues lie primarily with the textures. They haven't changed much in the intervening 8 years since the game release, and they really stand out. And the lighting effects highlight just how old they are. Facial animations and modelling aren't great either, coming off as somewhat, for lack of a better word, clay doll-like. As if the designers reached into a big jar of putty and moulded their characters hastily in an afternoon. While earlier games in the series relied on an art style uniquely their own, giving their character models some creative license, these models and their more realistic intent are just enough on the brink of uncanny valley to make them uncomfortable to look at for long periods of times. This game is a weird juxtaposition in the way it looks. Its lighting effects are incredible, with trees casting impressive shadows in the forest and buildings blocking the sun in city streets that look great. But its lackluster textures and character models make it feel almost like an older game than its predecessors. If Assassin's Creed 2 had unremarkable combat, Assassin's Creed 3's is remarkable in how they've managed to simplify one of gaming's most simple sword fighting systems. Throughout the series, combat has been simple and built on over the course of subsequent games. Assassin's Creed 3 saw the culmination of this gradual change and suffered as a result. Combat has been streamlined to an almost comical degree. There is no blocking, you just wait for a counter icon to appear above an enemy's head and hit the counter button. "Oh no!" you cry. "This enemy is bigger and counters my counters. What should I do?" Easy. Wait for the prompt and hit the disarm button. They become defenseless, allowing you to wail on them with your chosen weapon. It all feels very toothless, like a glorified QuickTime event. And it's all so sad, because the range of weapons on offer is fantastic, and they all look great too. Flintlocks look great, and Connor's Assassin's Emblem Tomahawk is great to look at. A pity it's so boring to use. Climbing is carried over from previous games in the series. The trigger still sends you climbing up a building, and holding A still sends you careening off ledges when you least want it to happen. The climbing remains, therefore, largely unchanged, and this is a problem. The system is really starting to show its age at this point. You still find yourself running up walls that can't be climbed accidentally, running off edges when you're chasing someone, and leaping off viewpoints in the wrong direction, tumbling to an ugly, untimely demise. Rather than updating the climbing, however, the developers chose a different route. Why not make players do less climbing and give them a wide open space to run around in? You know, just like they've been asking for. So they did. The frontier is big, empty, and boring. So boring. Yes, you can climb trees, and as such they've added some tree climbing animations to the free running system, but it works much the same as climbing up a building, minus the visual interest. Traversal is a pain, and I never found myself using the fast travel option in prior games. Here, though, I do, which definitely makes things feel better, if not a little cheaty. This game marked the final game to hold Desmond Miles as its main character, giving it the unenviable position of having to wrap up an endlessly boring present-day narrative that had only really started to become even vaguely interesting at the tail end of the previous entry. The stakes have risen, and the sci-fi weirdness is at its peak. But you know what? This is possibly my favourite present-day story of the Desmond Miles line of games. Desmond is still eye-rollingly boring, his compatriots are average, and the situations they are put on are almost comically dangerous. But there are stakes here, and a central drive that's lacking from the other games. It's this wonderfully silly sci-fi melodrama that I love. I still don't care about the characters or what becomes of them, but watching their story unfold as it becomes ever more otherworldly is twisty, fun, and enduringly, wonderfully dumb. The story as a whole is, of course, still set in two halves, as is the formula with Assassin's Creed at this point. The melodrama in the present is offset with our story told in colonial America, following the adventures in American history with our surly young Connor, the Native American assassin who wants to help kick the British out of the country. Along the way, you meet with pretty much everyone ever involved with American history and help them with their various quandaries. By the end, Connor has had a hand in effectively every single significant Civil War era historical event. And I think that's a problem. It quickly starts to feel like the writers were simply trying to check boxes. The historical figures in previous games were an important part of the story, but you weren't too involved in all the pivotal turning points of the time, while here they make up the majority of your interactions with the characters in game. This is a shame because the rest of the story is actually really, really good. The long introduction that I remembered as being annoying and boring is a great bit of world building and sets up an incredible twist that should have been praised at the time rather than derided. Connor is sympathetic and earnest rather than boring and uninspired. His motives are clearly defined and justifiable. The writing is generally excellent, and the villain is the best in the series to this point. People just didn't want something new, and they didn't like the intro because they wanted to jump straight in as an assassin, and they didn't like Connor simply because he wasn't Ezio. Now, being that Ubisoft wanted this game to be the next big step in Assassin's Creed, they added a whole host of different extra mini-games to increase the play value. Some were excellent and turned out to shape the series in the future, others are less successful. Added to this entry is hunting. In the aforementioned frontier, you wander around forests and plains to find animals to hunt and skin. These skins can be sold for profit, and crafted into things, weapons and the like. the same weapons you can purchase, with the money you gain from selling pelts and meat harvested during, you guessed it, hunting. A missed opportunity, perhaps, but neither is the hunting particularly engaging. Tracking is bare bones to say the least, and the range of animals on offer is particularly slim. Animal combat is far too simple, and fending off a pack of predators boils down to a simple quick-time event. Rough. There's also the apparently mandatory for the time lockpicking minigame, and, just like every other lockpicking minigame that's ever been conceived, it's a pain. Controls are confusing and there's no feedback as to whether you're getting it right. Even then, a well-designed lockpicking minigame is still a lockpicking minigame and comes with the biggest sin that any minigame comes with: slowing the pace. You could be in the midst of an exciting sequence, on the edge of your seat, giddy with anticipation, until you see it. The dreaded button prompt for the lockpicking minigame so that you can open a door. Yes, I'm aware that Assassin's Creed has always had button prompts to open chests and certain doors, but I've never had to twiddle the sticks in unfathomably irritating minigames in order to get to the next section of the game. Not everything they've added to this game is a problem, however. The ship segments are new, refreshing, and great fun. The sound of the sea, the singing of the men, and the crash of cannons all come together to create perhaps one of the best additions to an Assassin's Creed game to date, and one that showed players what was coming next. It lacks some refinement, but for its introduction it is absolutely captivating. What's not new are the assassinations. Here we are still given an area and a target, but we're also given certain parameters to fill. It's not necessarily too restrictive, but it does lack the freedom of the assassinations in the previous games. This is sad. The other games' assassinations were a puzzle in and of themselves, but this dumbs them down to fill certain boxes in order to get 100% synchronization, the idea being to get as close to what happened when Connor actually did his work all those years ago. Unfortunately, while it makes sense in a story point of view, from a gameplay perspective it's a massive disappointment. They've at least tried to improve the stealth elements. No longer are you stuck wandering around slowly behind targets or exclusively hunting quarry from the rooftops. No, now you can hide in bushes. But they're few and far between, and there's still no crouch option, and when you've been spotted for the millionth time, you're really going to want one. Mission structure here is vastly the same as the games that came before. There's no real great variety. However, what really sets off the "why am I playing this" alarms are the stalking and listening missions. Now, these were annoying in prior entries, but here they are downright exasperating. If you don't stay within the circle showing how far away from the target you can be to still hear their conversation, it's game over. If you're spotted by your target, you're done. If you brush past a passerby too roughly and they create a scene, it's finished. And they're so long. Sometimes it feels like you walk through every single street of a city before you've heard the vital piece of information you need to progress. These events are almost enough to put you off playing the game entirely. There are, of course, the requisite side missions that every open-world game needs, and for the most part, they're actually really fun. Missions done for Connor's homestead to invite new craftsmen are individually different and interesting, introducing you to various new characters that will help you through the game. You can, of course, choose to take on Templar presences as well, helping the locals with tax collectors or taking down forts. Unfortunately returning, however, are the old delivery missions, and they're as numerous and annoying as they always have been. Thankfully, though, you can avoid them, and you're not going to need the money they provide either. Returning is the home base, with all the financial bells and whistles we've come to expect from an Assassin's Creed game. This time you have to put a little effort in, use those pelts you got from hunting and trade them for money, which you can use to buy more trading materials, which in turn you can trade for, you guessed it, money. Spend money to make money, as they say, but there comes a point when you just don't need the money. You'll probably put up with the numbers and potential trade routes long enough to afford the various weapons, but after that you'll give up. Trading turns out to be very boring. I mean, did you come for cool assassinations, or for glorified Excel spreadsheets and the ability to become a colonial trading magnate? No, I thought not. Thankfully, it never gets bad enough to completely turn you off the game. And that's good, because at its core, Assassin's Creed 3 is still a good game with a great story to tell. No, it's not as good as 2. Yes, its climbing is disappointing and the landscape bland, but the story is excellent, and the ship missions make this game worth playing more than you might expect. I reckon you'll have completely misjudged this game when it came out, just like me, and it's definitely worth replaying. You may discover that it's a lot better than you remember. Thanks for watching this episode of Playing by Series. I've been Matt, and we're on the Den. If you'd like to watch more of this series or take a look at our video game reviews, get subscribed, and stay tuned next week for the next episode of Playing by Series, and a new comparison on Thursday. Thanks for watching, and stay safe.